Hey everyone, Tactics here, where in this video I'm going to be breaking down my first impressions of the Season 2 Mythic Plus dungeons here in the War Within, now that we've been able to test the initial adjustments Blizzard has made to all of them on the PTR, and of course also be giving my feedback on the dungeons that will hopefully address some of the problem points that I personally have after all the testing. I've noticed quite a bit of dooming about this dungeon pool on social media, a lot of which was reactions to data mining before testing had even occurred, which honestly I think were pretty large overreactions. And I'll just say it here right at the start of the video. I think Season 2 is going to be better than Season 1. That being said, Season 2 still has some problems, so let's talk about those and what I think should be done to fix them. As a note here, I'm not going to be spending a lot of time talking about the brand new dungeon Operation Floodgate, as I actually have a standalone video for that over on my channel if you want to see that. But generally for that dungeon, I do really like how it plays out. I like the layout of the dungeon, and I think it's going to be a great addition to Season 2. Now, let's get right into it. Where to start? I want to talk about my two main points of general feedback here for the season, starting with graveyards. For 5 out of the 8 dungeons, I actually think graveyards are not a problem. They're totally fine. But specifically for 3 of the War Within dungeons, the run back time from deaths is just awful, especially when you factor in the fact that the 15-second death penalty affix still exists currently on the PTR, making deaths just feel insanely punishing at times. I'll go into more feedback in my dungeon specific stuff, but I would love to see them make some updates to graveyards, specifically in the Rookery, Darkflame Cleft, and Priory. I will also accept a replacement of the Challenger's Peril affix. I've talked about this a lot, so not going to go into big detail here about that, but I do think that deaths are already punishing enough, so tripling the death timer with this affix feels like a bit much, and puts also a lot more pressure on the tank role specifically, where now all of a sudden if you die, you've basically lost 75 seconds on your timer, since take deaths often lead to full group wipes. Then I wanted to talk a bit about interrupts and stops, where currently it does look like Blizzard is opting to keep stops less relevant than Dragonflight, though I will say that I think they are making some adjustments that go about this in a better way than Season 1. For starters, there are more situations where AoE stops have kind of more general value, as there are several areas in multiple different dungeons here where there's a large amount of mobs that either do channeled casts or they have a relatively long cast time, which allows you to do things like CC chain packs to actually pull larger, even if you don't have the kicks to have everything covered. Personally, I think this is a much healthier place for AoE stops to be in. High value in some areas and kind of lower value in others. I can definitely see how the state they were in at the end of Dragonflight was a bit problematic, so I can understand why they're moving away from that, but I think this is moving in a healthier direction where AoE stops have more value than Season 1, but less than Dragonflight. On top of this, it does also seem like they're making sweeping changes across the entire dungeon pool to interrupts, where the count of interrupts across most dungeons is much lower than in Season 1. That being said, there are still parts of dungeons where the quantity of specifically spam casters in packs can be a bit problematic. For example, in Priory, this can be an issue in the last boss area, as the packs are kind of divided into 3 mob sections, and then in these 3 mobs there's 2 of them which are spam casters, so you can't even like double pull packs in this area of 3 mobs without being overwhelmed by kicks. And similarly, Rookery, in the first boss area, there's actually packs that just have 4 spam casters as part of the pull. Like, it's not like you're double pulling, that's the pull, it's 4 spam casters, so that's a bit much. I'm not saying spam casters can't exist here, I just think they need to be a bit more thoughtful when it comes to the pack compositions that include spam casters in them. Overall, I do think the adjustments they're making to increase the value of AoE stops in certain areas, as well as decrease the number of kicks required to complete your average pull in a dungeon, are positive, but there are some tweaks that need to be made, like I said, spam casters and some other dungeon specific stuff. So let's actually get into that now with the elephant in the room, Darkflame Cleft, and let's just start talking about the minecart, guys. I know you all want to talk about it. So I will say, so my initial testing was done with some default buffs. Blizzard threw in a bunch of buffs to the minecart thing initially before testing it started, and they're almost there. I don't think this minecart is nearly as bad as some other people potentially. I think it's not great, and I think there are a couple relatively small tweaks Blizzard can make to what they've already done to the minecart to actually make it totally fine. So they've like done things like increase the radius. I think they've also increased the speed and stuff. What I will say is I think the decay rate on the candles, the fire, the light, whatever it is, that could probably be decreased a bit. So you make it decay a bit slower. So you need to get potentially less candles. And the other thing is I would like to see a speed increase, specifically when mobs are near the minecart. So currently the minecart, it goes fast, and then if mobs get near it, it goes really, really slow. I'd like to see it go faster when there are mobs near it, and also honestly probably a little bit faster when there are no mobs near it as well. But I think between those two things, if you reduce the decay rate and you increase the speed of the minecart by a little bit, this is going to feel honestly kind of fine. It's not even going to be a big deal. So I assume deleting it is just out of the question at this point. It's not going to happen. So I'd rather focus on what they can do to make this feel good. And I think it's just those two things. They've already done quite a bit. The radius is decent. Maybe you could do a small radius bump, but I don't think that's super important. Again, I think the speed and the decay rate are much, much more important. Outside of this, like I mentioned earlier, this is one of the dungeons that I think has some problematic graveyards. That basically what happens is if after you've defeated the first boss, there's like this, you start at the beginning still, but there's like a minecart that kind of takes you quickly to the first boss room. That's kind of fine, but once you jump down and go towards the second boss, the graveyard is still at the beginning of the dungeon, and the minecart still only takes you to like the first boss room. And so you have this really long walk. And to be honest with you, the minecart is not fast. Also, on top of that, it's fine if you're wiping a little bit before the second boss. But once you start wiping on the second boss or between the second and third boss, it is super, super problematic in terms of the run back duration. And I'd like to see potentially them just add a graveyard to the second boss. Also, once you've done the third boss, you've done the minecart, and you're in the fourth boss area, the last boss area, if you die in that area, you actually have to do the minecart like running away from the boss thing again, which is, that's crazy. That needs to be pushed to the area after the minecart RP for sure, which is actually like the first boss room, I think, because you end up doubling back in the dungeon. So put a graveyard there, maybe put a graveyard after the second boss, or even just put the graveyard in the first boss room, and honestly do away with the little minecart thing. It's like, I get they want these flavor things, but that one is very minor. It's only done until like the first boss room, and it's just, I don't know, it's not even that fast. I'm not a fan of it. Just put some graveyards in there, please, I beg. One other thing about this dungeon is the spamcaster situation. Like I mentioned, spamcasters actually feature pretty heavily in this dungeon up until the third boss. They exist. There's a couple different types of mobs that basically have these firebolt casts. I will say this dungeon is not that egregious when it comes to spamcasters. The compositions are such that you can usually only pull 2 of these at a time with a decent sized pack. So it's not actually the end of the world. And if they want to make this the spamcaster dungeon, like similar to something like Ruby Life Pools was in Dragonflight, I actually think that is fine. But potentially maybe a couple of these mob types that do these fireballs, you could adjust their either cooldown, add a cooldown to the fireball, or maybe even increase the cast time a little bit, just to make it a little bit more forgiving. Now let's move on to the Rookery, which I think is the worst dungeon after testing. Let's start with the spamcaster situation. Like I mentioned, there are packs in the first boss area that have 4 spamcasters in an individual pack. That is too much. That is way, way, way too much. They also all have this buff, which gives them increased cast speed. And you can't purge them all at once, because purging them does AoE damage and puts a debuff on you guys, increasing nature damage taken. It's pretty toxic. And I think there just can't be 4 of them in a pack if they're spam casters, just period. That can't exist. And the funny thing about this dungeon too is, as soon as you get past the first boss, there are almost 0 kicks in the dungeon. Just to pass the first boss, nothing. They're actually like, I'm actually going to recommend here, add a kick on one of the mobs between the first and second boss. Not necessarily a new ability here. It's not like there's no abilities between, you know, the first boss to the end of the boss, end of the dungeon, right? But there are a lot of abilities that have no kick bar. They just go off. So make one of them a kick here so that you have something to kick, because currently there are 0 kicks between the first and second boss. Absolutely 0, but it's not like there's 0 abilities. So make something kickable. And then we get to graveyards, where this is the absolute worst run back dungeon of the season as well. You always spawn at the start of the dungeon, no matter when you die. You have to run down the balcony, get to the griffins. If you've only died in the first boss area, it's totally fine. This is a fine run back. But if you've died anywhere after the first boss, you have like a 2-minute run back ahead of you. Like you have to run up, get to this griffin. This griffin flies you to the tower, and then you have to run through the tower. And the funny thing is, if you wipe near the second boss, it's actually a longer run back than if you wipe near the last boss, because there's a shortcut kind of if you run through the last boss. It's still a really, really long run back. But I think just generally, again, this is one where flavor is just making this feel absolutely terrible. And if this griffin flew you all the way into the tower and like towards where the packs are, that would be fine. But it's the fact that this basically just flies you the same distance as it flies you towards the first boss, and then just leaves you there and forces you to run the rest of the way. It's too much. It's way too much. I think where they need to add graveyards is at the bottom of the tower after you kill the first boss and jump down right there, right at the bottom. That's where your second graveyard should be. And then your third graveyard should be in the second boss room after you kill the second boss. That's just where the graveyards need to be, and that would feel so much better. Because right now it's just, honestly, it's insane how bad the graveyards are in this dungeon. Let's move on to Priory, the Sacred Flame. There is a pretty powerful dungeon buff in the start of this dungeon, which is only activatable currently by Priest and Paladin. I would like them to add something more to this that can activate it. Maybe there is, maybe I'm missing it, but maybe something like enchanting that is accessible to all players, or some sort of a few races here as well, just to make this buff a bit more accessible, because it currently is a very powerful buff. Moving on to the first boss, this has seen some changes where you basically now are forced to fight the boss with one of the lieutenants, which I think is a cool idea. But I will say one of the lieutenants, Elena Emberlands, is definitely way too powerful and will need a nerf if you want to make her a realistic option to do with the boss. She just does the most tank damage and the most group damage right now, which is a bad combo. She's perma avoided. Again, if that's fine with Blizzard, leave her as is. Just no one will ever play her with the boss. That's fine, whatever. But if they want her to be a viable option with the boss, they need to nerf something about her, maybe change some of her abilities and how they function. Graveyards, I think there just needs to be a graveyard in the second boss room after you kill the second boss. Just that's your new graveyard. Again, it's pretty simple to do, because right now, if you die anytime after, I mean, even if you die after the first boss in the second boss room, it's kind of a long run back. You start at the beginning of the dungeon always. But if you die in like the third boss room, you're running back from the start of the dungeon. That it feels awful. Again, I will say Rookery is more egregious in my mind than this dungeon, but this one is still bad. So again, make graveyard in second boss room, I beg. Spam casters, as I already talked about at the end of the dungeon, they're a bit too plentiful. There's packs of 3 mobs, and 2 of them are spam casters. There's the priests. These guys have 3 different interruptible spells on their own, and then there's mages, which have 2 on their own. So these packs of 3 have 5 different kicks, and a couple of them are coming from spam casters that you need to interrupt. And I think it's just too much. Even if you pull 3 mobs, like you could just pull the 3 mob pack, there's 5 kicks between those 3 mobs. It's too much. It's going to overwhelm groups. You need to actually delete some of the casts here, like either make it an ability that doesn't need to be interrupted, and reduce the effect accordingly, or just straight up delete abilities off these mobs because it's too much. Potentially add some longer CDs to things as well, just to make it, again, a little bit less overwhelming and give players the ability to potentially pull more than 3 mobs at a time, because we've been through this. Players don't want to sit there hitting 1 trash mob, 2 trash mobs, even 3 trash mobs. Pull sizes, in my opinion, should be somewhere between 4 to 8-ish. That's kind of like, the sweet spot for me. And maybe sometimes you could do these giga pulls, and maybe sometimes you have to pull like a mini boss with like a couple mobs or something, right? So it being sometimes out of that range is fine, but I think the goal should be to hit 4 to 8 for pack sizes. And the fact that you have to pull 3 mobs, 3 mobs, 3 mobs all throughout this room because there's just too many casters is a bit much. So again, dial it back a bit in this area. Dial it back. Then we move on to Cinderbrew, which I think might have the least kicks out of any dungeon in this this season so far. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it is interesting to see. Though again, kind of like what I was talking about in the Rookery after the first boss, I do think some abilities that already exist in the dungeon that aren't interruptible should probably be made interruptible. I think the taste tester mobs in one of the wings is an example of this. They have a random target kick that's not kickable. That's fine. But then they have an enrage effect, which basically turns that random target hit into a near one shot or a one shot, even on a +10. So I'd recommend one, nerfing the damage a little bit of their random target hit, but then also making their enrage an interrupt, so that not the only solution is having an AoE soothe, which by the way is only available to evokers. And again, doing so is not going to overwhelm people with interrupts in this area, and I think just gives another way to make these mobs more manageable and actually outplay the damage intake that they could potentially do. And then similarly, on the other side of the dungeon, there's the Bee Wranglers, and they have this ability called Bestial Wrath, which is an AoE enrage effect. So instead of just enraging the individual mobs like the taste testers do, though again, taste testers come multiple in a pack, so there's quite a few going out, this Bee Wrangler is going to enrage all the bees around it. This should definitely be a kick, in my opinion. Again, Evoker's the only AoE enrage. Can we stop putting AoE enrages that have no other counterplay besides AoE soothing? Not a fan of that. And like I said, this area also doesn't have a lot of kicks in it, so adding a kick on a mob that has a cooldown is not really a big deal. Moving on to some of the older dungeons returning, let's talk about the Motherlode, another dungeon that has exceptionally few kicks outside of some casters here between the second and third boss. Oddly enough, there are some abilities that still follow stop rules, like dragonflight abilities. I assume this is just spells that haven't been updated yet, and I'm going to assume they're going to be gone, but that does currently exist in this dungeon. The Peacekeepers, the big robots at the beginning of the dungeon, they have an ability which is a bit over 2 at the moment. Their charge shield is basically a tank hit, and then they get a buff for 15 seconds that does like chain lightning casts. That needs to be brought down a bit. The chain lightning damage is pretty high at the moment, and that's kind of the pattern I would say in this dungeon, where it's a lot of AoE damage that is problematic and not necessarily other stuff. So for example, after the first boss, there's the Azurite extractors, and they have this rapid extraction channel which deals pretty high amount of damage, but also it forces you to move a lot because it spawns a ton of circles. And so I think the solution here is to increase the time between ticks a bit, but also increase the damage of those ticks, so that the damage intake remains the same, but the number of circles that spawn and the amount of time you need to be spend moving during this channel is decreased. Feels a bit more fair that way. Finally, in the caster area, like I was talking about, there's the Masterminds. These guys have an ability called Brainwave, which spawns a bunch of tornadoes on the ground. If you touch these tornadoes, they give you like a 6-second or something like that silence. It's a really, really long silence debuff even after you've already left the tornado. So maybe make this silence only affect you while you're touching a tornado, or make it persist for like 1 or 2 seconds. Or 6 seconds is definitely a bit much. Moving on to Workshop, this is actually the main culprit about the online dooming I was talking about at the beginning of this video. But after testing, I have to say I really like the changes that they've made to both the trash as well as the first boss. First boss is basically now a 2-target cleave fight. You only have to remove the plating on the big robot guy once every time he does his ultimate ability. That being said, this fight isn't perfect. I would like to see a more defined edge on the bombs that spawn after they're actually like activated and in place. When they're spawning, they have that new circle animation, which is great. It's very clear. But once they're actually active, it's actually a bit hard to tell where the part of the bomb that's going to blow up if you touch it is. So a little bit more clear on that animation. Moving past that, this is again a dungeon very light on kicks, where currently there's no interrupts between the first and second boss. So I'd recommend making the corrosive gunk cast from the metal gunk mobs actually an interrupt, especially because there's a lot of AoE damage in this area with the new mega drill ability from the processing unit. So having one of them be preventable with interrupts is nice counterplay in my opinion. Moving on to Theater of Pain. I'm going to say it off at the beginning here, I'm not a Theater of Pain hater. I enjoyed the dungeon in Shadowlands. I'm happy to see it back, and I think some of the changes are pretty good. So the first boss seems very good. The bosses before, if you remember, they were basically a giant pain to actually move around properly. They're spam cast a ton. They've actually changed a fair bit, so they don't spam cast quite as much. They've adjusted the ultimate abilities of the boss, and they've actually put a bit of a cooldown, it seems, between their interrupts, so they're easier to manage, and they actually move around with the tank. So it's actually nice. I actually like the changes made to this boss, and that gets a big thumbs up from me. The banners, Necrolord banners, are gone. They're there in the dungeon, but you can't interact with them. At least with the comp we had, there's no way to actually interact with them. So looks like that buff is not going to be available in this dungeon, which that's fine by me. I will say the changes to the Kultharok boss, the Necromancer guy, I'm a bit less sure about. Basically, they've kind of removed that whole double magic debuff part of that boss. That's gone, and instead there's like some ad spawning where you have to kill the ads before they reach the boss, and then there's like a bunch of orbs that spin around the boss at all times basically, and then occasionally 3 people get a circle around them where they're doing cleave damage, and they take a bunch of extra damage. So it's a bit different. I will say very annoying for melee DPS if you have like more than one in your group, because you got those random target AoEs, but you've also got an orb rotating around the boss. And I forgot to mention it, there's also a tank frontal on top of all of that. So my only recommendation here is to make this a little bit more melee friendly. Maybe delete the orb that rotates around the melee hitbox of the boss, because melee already have to, 1, make sure they're not on the tank because there's a frontal. 2, make sure they're not in the puddle directly under the boss because the boss is stationary. And 3, they also have to be spread from each other to avoid cleaving those random target AoEs that go out. So a lot for melee to handle in this fight. So maybe tone it back a little bit, make it a little bit nicer for them. Like a lot of the other dungeons this season, this is one that is following the pattern of having not a ton of kicks. There is the Necromancer wing where the bulk of the kicks are, but I believe there's like no kicks, maybe 1 kick in the Zav wing, and then there's like a couple kicks in the Construct ring. But again, generally not a ton of kicks here, which I think is a good thing, given the stop changes and the fact that, you know, still there's a lot of stuff that isn't stoppable. But there we have it, guys. That is my thoughts and feedback for the Season 2 dungeons after my initial testing on the PTR. Overall, definitely optimistic about this season, and I think it's shaping up to be better than Season 1, but I would love to know what you guys think. How do you feel about this dungeon pool now that you've actually seen it in action? How did you like the Xal'atath affixes and the changes going into them? Let me know down in the comments below. And while you're there, make sure you do hit that subscribe button. It's free to do, and it's one of the best ways to actually support me. Otherwise, shout out to all of my amazing Patreons for making all this content possible, and I'll see everyone in the next video.